June 15, 1944, 05:30 hours, the waters off Saipan, Mariana Islands. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon crouched in the landing craft as it churned toward the reef line, his M1 Garand clutched against his chest. Around him, Marines of the 2nd Division checked their weapons one final time, fingers tracing the familiar contours of walnut stocks and parkerized steel. The 18-year-old from East Los Angeles had grown up in a Japanese-American foster family, spoke fluent Japanese, and was about to discover that language wasn't the only advantage he carried onto that beach. What Gabaldon didn't know, what none of the Marines knew as their Higgins boat scraped against coral that morning, was that Japanese defenders on Saipan had been told something remarkable about American soldiers. Imperial Army intelligence officers had briefed Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito's garrison that American infantry relied on massed artillery and air support because their individual soldiers were poor marksmen who could not match Japanese riflemen in direct combat. The Americans, they were assured, fired wildly and wasted ammunition. Within 72 hours, Guy Gabaldon would capture over 800 Japanese soldiers single-handedly, earning him the nickname the Pied Piper of Saipan. But his success depended on something beyond his language skills. It depended on Japanese soldiers recognizing that resistance against American firepower was futile. They had learned this lesson not from artillery or aircraft, but from the 8-round semi-automatic rifles that every Marine carried. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The collision between Japanese expectations and American reality on Saipan would shatter illusions that had persisted since the Russo-Japanese War. For 40 years, Japanese military doctrine had taught that spiritual power and bayonet charges could overcome material disadvantages. The M1 Garand would prove this belief catastrophically wrong, not through abstract statistics, but through the lived experience of Japanese soldiers who discovered that their enemies could fire 8 aimed rounds in the time it took to work a bolt action twice. The roots of Japanese misunderstanding stretched back to 1905, to the snow-covered battlefields of Manchuria, where Japanese infantry had defeated the Russian Empire. At Mukden, at Port Arthur, at the Yalu River, Japanese soldiers armed with bolt-action Type 30 Arisaka rifles had triumphed through discipline, night attacks, and willingness to accept casualties that would have broken European armies. These victories created a mythology that became institutionalized doctrine. The Japanese Army Infantry Manual, revised in 1928 and still in use during World War II, stated explicitly that the spiritual power of the Japanese soldier could overcome any material disadvantage. One passage read, "The bayonet charge is the supreme expression of the Japanese warrior spirit. No enemy can withstand the determination of soldiers who have resolved to die for the emperor." This wasn't mere propaganda for public consumption. It was taught as military science at the Imperial Army Academy in Tokyo, at the infantry school in Chiba, at officer training courses throughout the empire. Young lieutenants learned that their Arisaka rifles, whether the older Type 38 in 6.5 mm or the newer Type 99 in 7.7 mm, were adequate weapons because Japanese soldiers were superior warriors. The mathematics of their rifles told a different story. The Type 38, adopted in 1905, held 5 rounds in its internal magazine, loaded via stripper clips. After each shot, the soldier had to rotate the bolt handle upward, pull it fully rearward to extract and eject the spent cartridge, push it forward to strip a new round from the magazine and chamber it, then rotate the handle down to lock the bolt in battery. A well-trained soldier could manage this cycle in approximately 2 to 3 seconds under ideal conditions. In combat, under stress, in darkness, in rain, while being shot at, the cycle took longer. Much longer. The Type 99, introduced in 1939, used the more powerful 7.7 by 58 mm cartridge, but retained the same bolt-action mechanism. 5 rounds. Manual cycling, the same fundamental limitation that had existed since the Mauser brothers revolutionized military rifles in the 1890s. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American industry had been preparing a revolution. John Cantius Garand, a Canadian immigrant working at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, had spent 17 years perfecting a semi-automatic rifle that would fire as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. No bolt. Manipulation required. No breaking the sight picture between shots. Just squeeze. Fire. Acquire the next target. Squeeze again. The United States Army officially adopted Garand's design on January 9, 1936, making America the first nation in the world to issue a semi-automatic rifle as standard infantry equipment. The decision was controversial. Many officers worried about ammunition waste, about mechanical complexity, about the loss of traditional marksmanship skills. General Douglas MacArthur himself had intervened in the rifle's development, insisting in 1932 that it be chambered for the existing 30 caliber .06 Springfield cartridge, rather than the lighter .276 Pedersen round originally planned. This decision delayed production, but proved prescient. The powerful .30-06, launching a 150-grain bullet at 2,853 feet per second, provided stopping power and range that would prove devastating in Pacific combat. By the time Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Springfield Armory had produced approximately 600,000 M1 Garands. Production was accelerating rapidly, with Winchester Repeating Arms Company beginning manufacturing as a second source. The American industrial machine was just getting started. Japanese intelligence knew about the M1 Garand. They had examined captured examples during the Chinese Expeditionary Force operations of 1937 through 1941. Technical reports circulated through Imperial Army channels describing the American semi-automatic rifle's specifications: 8-round en-bloc clip, gas-operated rotating bolt, effective rate of fire of 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. But knowing specifications and understanding implications are different things entirely. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the Imperial Army's most influential staff officers, architect of the Malayan campaign, dismissed the M1 Garand as an example of American over-reliance on technology. In a planning document for operations against British and American forces, he wrote, "The Americans compensate for their lack of warrior spirit with mechanical devices. Their automatic rifle is evidence of this weakness. A Japanese soldier with proper spiritual training will always defeat an American who depends on his machine." This assessment would be tested on August 7, 1942, when the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Marines who splashed ashore that morning were armed primarily with M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifles, the same type of weapon Japanese soldiers carried. The M1 Garand had not yet reached Marine units in significant numbers. The fighting on Guadalcanal in those early months saw both sides armed with similar rifle technology. Japanese night attacks, while costly, achieved tactical successes. The assault on Bloody Ridge in September 1942 pushed Marine defenders to their limits. Japanese infantry doctrine seemed validated. Then, the Army arrived. On October 13, 1942, the 164th Infantry Regiment of the American Division landed on Guadalcanal. Unlike the Marines, every soldier in the 164th carried an M1 Garand. They were National Guardsmen from North Dakota, men who had never seen combat, who had trained with their semi-automatic rifles on the windswept plains of the northern Midwest. 11 days later, they would demonstrate what those rifles could do. The Japanese Sendai Division, approximately 3,000 men of the 29th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Masajiro Furumiya, launched a coordinated night assault against Henderson Field on October 24th. Their objective was the airfield that gave Americans air superiority over the Southern Solomons. Their method was the same that had worked against the British in Malaya, against the Americans in the Philippines. A screaming bayonet charge that would break enemy morale and overwhelm defensive positions through sheer aggression. The soldiers of the Sendai Division were veterans. They had fought in China, in Manchuria, against enemies who had often broken under the psychological pressure of a banzai charge. As they formed up in the jungle darkness south of Henderson Field, their officers reminded them of their spiritual superiority, of the shame of retreat, of the glory awaiting those who died for the Emperor, At approximately 2200 hours, the first wave emerged from the jungle, screaming at the top of their lungs. Private First Class Robert Young Deere of the 164th Infantry, positioned alongside Marines of the 7th Regiment, described what happened next in a letter home that survived in family archives. They came out of the dark like something from a nightmare. Hundreds of them, maybe. Thousands, hollering words we couldn't understand. The Marines next to us started shooting with their Springfields. Crack, work the bolt. Crack, work the bolt. But we had our Garands. I started pulling the trigger and didn't stop until I heard that ping. 8 shots in maybe 5 seconds. Reload. 8 more. The boys with Springfields were still working their bolts for their 3rd round when I was on my 2nd clip. The mathematics that Japanese planners had dismissed as irrelevant now became lethal arithmetic. A company of 180 men armed with M1 Garands could deliver approximately 7,200 aimed rounds per minute. The same number of men with bolt-action rifles could manage approximately 2,700. In the first 30 seconds of the Japanese assault, the disparity meant roughly 2,000 additional rounds, impacting the charging enemy. Colonel Bryant Moore, commanding the 164th Infantry, reported that his regiment expended over 250,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition in 2 days of fighting. The Japanese dead lay in windrows in front of positions held by the army troops, many killed at distances of less than 50 yards, where the rapid semi-automatic fire had caught them mid-charge. Sergeant Masao Watanabe of the 29th Infantry Regiment was one of the few survivors of that assault. Captured later in the campaign and interviewed by American intelligence officers, he provided testimony that appears in declassified interrogation reports. We expected to reach their positions before they could reload. Our officers told us that bolt-action rifles gave us this opportunity, but the Americans fired continuously. There was no pause to work a bolt. We were being cut down while still 30 meters from their holes. I saw men fall who had not even raised their rifles to fire a single shot. The Battle of Henderson Field cost the Sendai Division over 2,500 dead. American casualties were a fraction of that number. More importantly, Japanese tactical assumptions had been invalidated. The night bayonet charge, foundation of Japanese infantry doctrine, had failed against semi-automatic firepower, but institutional beliefs die hard. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal faced a cognitive dilemma. Accepting that their doctrine was fundamentally flawed meant questioning everything they had been taught about warfare, about Japanese superiority, about the spiritual foundation of military power. Many chose instead to attribute the defeat to insufficient preparation, inadequate artillery support, or simply bad luck. The lessons that should have been learned were not learned, or rather, they were learned by individual soldiers and junior officers, but could not penetrate the institutional resistance of the Imperial Japanese Army's high command. Corporal Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving fighter ace, observed this phenomenon from his hospital bed after being wounded over Guadalcanal. In his post-war memoir, he reflected on conversations with infantry officers who had fought on the island. They spoke of American firepower as if it were a temporary condition, something that could be overcome with more determination, better planning, more troops. They could not accept that the fundamental equation had changed, that machines had made courage insufficient. The 18 months between Guadalcanal and Saipan saw Japanese forces fortify islands across the Pacific, while American industrial production performed miracles that would have seemed impossible to Japanese planners. Springfield Armory increased M1 Garand production to over 1,000 rifles per day. Winchester contributed 600 daily. By the time Marines landed on Saipan, virtually every American infantryman in the Pacific carried a semi-automatic rifle. Japanese production told a different story. The Kokura Arsenal, Tokyo Arsenal, Nagoya Arsenal, and other facilities continued, manufacturing bolt-action Arisaka rifles, using methods that had changed little since 1905. Each rifle required careful hand-fitting by skilled armourers. Quality was high in early production, but the sheer numbers required for a global war strained Japanese manufacturing capacity. More critically, Japan never developed a semi-automatic rifle for mass production. The Type 4 rifle, essentially a copy of the M1 Garand modified for 7.7mm ammunition, existed only as a prototype program that produced approximately 100 to 125 complete rifles before the war ended. Japanese engineers understood the M1's advantages. Japanese industry simply could not replicate it at scale. By June 1944, this industrial disparity had become an unbridgeable gulf. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded approximately 31,000 Japanese defenders on Saipan, including the veteran 43rd Division and elements of various naval infantry units. Saito was a realistic officer who understood the challenges he faced. In a message to Tokyo before the American landing, he wrote, "We will fight to the last man, but I cannot guarantee victory against enemy material superiority." The material superiority Saito referenced was visible from the moment American forces appeared offshore. The invasion fleet included over 500 ships. Naval gunfire support came from 7 battleships, 11 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. Carrier aircraft dominated the skies. Japanese defenders watched this armada approach with a mixture of determination and dread. But the most devastating weapon in the American arsenal was not visible from Japanese positions on the bluffs overlooking the invasion beaches. It was carried in the hands of every Marine and soldier who climbed down cargo nets into landing craft. Over 20,000 M1 Garands would come ashore on Saipan in the first 24 hours. The landing began at 05:45 on June 15th. 8,000 Marines hit the beaches in the first 20 minutes, facing immediate heavy fire from Japanese positions in the ridgelines above the landing zones. The assault waves pushed inland under conditions that should have favoured the defenders. Private First Class Carl Matthews of the 4th Marine Division described the beach fighting in a letter that survives in the National Archives. Japs were dug in everywhere, in caves, in trenches, behind walls. They'd pop up, fire, duck back down. But with the Garand, you could put 8 rounds into their position before they could work their bolt twice. We learned to watch for movement, any movement, and just start squeezing. The rifle did the rest. Japanese defenders on Saipan experienced something that contradicted everything their training had taught them. American soldiers were not the poor marksmen they had been promised. American infantry did not depend solely on artillery and air support. When Japanese positions engaged American rifle squads at close range, they discovered that each American seemed to possess the firepower of multiple men. Lieutenant Taro Kawaguchi of the 136th Infantry Regiment kept a diary that was recovered after his death. His entry for June 16th reads, "The enemy's rifle fire is unlike anything described in our training manuals. They fire continuously without pause. Our men cannot advance in the open because the Americans shoot so quickly that the ground itself seems to erupt with their bullets. I counted 8 shots from a single enemy position in what seemed like 3 seconds. This is not possible with a rifle like ours." Kawaguchi's observation reflected the fundamental disconnect between Japanese expectations and American reality. He had been trained to expect pauses in enemy fire, moments when their opponents would be working rifle bolts that could be exploited for movement, or counterfire. Those pauses did not exist against M1 Garands. The first major Japanese counterattack came on the night of June 16th, when approximately 1,000 soldiers of the 136th Infantry attacked Marine positions near Saipan. The assault followed traditional Japanese doctrine: night approach, coordination flares, screaming charge with fixed bayonets. Staff Sergeant Remy Gautier of the 2nd Marine Division commanded a machine gun section that night. His after-action report, preserved in Marine Corps archives, describes the engagement. The Japs came across open ground toward our perimeter at approximately 0200 hours. Our riflemen opened up with their Garands before the Japs were halfway across. The volume of fire was incredible. I've operated machine guns since '39, and I've never heard rifle fire that dense. By the time my guns got into action, there were already dozens of Jap bodies in the wire. The mathematics were inescapable. A Marine rifle platoon of approximately 43 men armed with Garands could deliver over 1,700 aimed rounds in the first minute of contact. A Japanese rifle platoon of similar size, armed with Arisaka rifles, could manage approximately 600. In that first minute, American defenders fired nearly 3 times as many rounds at charging Japanese infantry. The counterattack failed with heavy casualties. Similar attacks over the following nights met similar results. Japanese officers, committed to doctrine that had worked against less well-armed opponents, sent wave after wave of infantry against positions where semi-automatic firepower created killing zones that courage alone could not penetrate. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, the young Marine from East Los Angeles, witnessed this slaughter and found an alternative approach. Using his fluent Japanese, he began venturing alone into the hills to convince Japanese soldiers and civilians that surrender was preferable to certain death. His success rate was remarkable. Small groups at first, then dozens, eventually hundreds of prisoners who chose life over futile resistance. Gabaldon later described his technique in interviews. "I'd tell them the truth. I'd say, 'You've seen how fast our rifles fire. You've seen your friends die before they could get close enough to use their bayonets. The war is over for Saipan. You can die for nothing. Or you can surrender and live.' Most of them already knew I was right. They'd been on the receiving end of Garand fire. They knew resistance was suicide. His honesty worked because Japanese soldiers had experienced firsthand what he described. The 8-round semi-automatic rifle had created conditions where traditional Japanese infantry tactics were not just unsuccessful, but suicidal. Soldiers who had been told that American infantry were poor shots, who wasted ammunition, had discovered the opposite. American riflemen delivered accurate, rapid fire that made open-ground movement lethal. The battle for Saipan ground on through June and into July, with Japanese forces pushed steadily northward. Resistance remained fierce, but the pattern established in the first days persisted. Every Japanese counterattack met walls of semi-automatic fire. Every attempt to close for hand-to-hand combat, where Japanese soldiers believed their training gave them an advantage, resulted in decimation before contact could be achieved. On July 7th, the remnants of the Japanese garrison launched what would become the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Approximately 3,000 soldiers, many wounded, some armed only with bayonets lashed to bamboo poles, formed up for a final attack against American lines near Tanapag. The assault began at dawn. Japanese soldiers emerged from ravines and caves, officers leading with drawn swords, enlisted men following with bayonets fixed. They screamed their battle cries and ran toward the American perimeter. Private First Class Harold Agerholm of the 4th Marine Division was in the path of that charge. He would earn a posthumous Medal of Honor that day, not for fighting but for rescuing wounded Marines under fire. But before he began his evacuation runs, he witnessed the initial impact of the banzai attack against American firepower. Corporal William O'Brien, also of the 4th Marine Division, commanded a rifle squad in the line that morning. He refused evacuation despite being wounded 3 times and continued directing fire until his ammunition was exhausted and he was killed in hand-to-hand fighting. His Medal of Honor citation noted that he killed or wounded approximately 30 enemy soldiers with his M1 Garand before picking up an abandoned weapon when his own ran dry. The mathematics of the July 7th banzai charge were devastating. 3,000 Japanese soldiers attacked American positions, defended by multiple battalions armed primarily with M1 Garands, supported by machine guns and artillery. In the initial minutes, before Japanese infantry could close to bayonet range, thousands of semi-automatic rifle rounds swept through their ranks. First Lieutenant Ben Sohn, a Marine officer who survived the battle, provided testimony that appears in the official Marine Corps history. "They came at us in waves, shoulder to shoulder in some places. Our boys opened fire and just kept firing. No working bolts, no pauses, just continuous fire. The Japs in front went down, then the ones behind them. They kept coming, climbing over their own dead, and we kept shooting. I saw Marines fire 3 or 4 clips, 24 to 32 rounds, before the first wave even reached our wire." Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers died on July 7th, including General Saito, who committed ritual suicide rather than face capture. American casualties were a fraction of that number. The disparity demonstrated once more what semi-automatic firepower meant against opponents armed with bolt-action rifles and committed to close-quarters tactics. But the lesson of Saipan extended beyond casualty statistics. The battle revealed that Japanese infantry doctrine, developed against opponents with similar weapons technology, was fundamentally obsolete against American forces equipped with M1 Garands. The night attack, the bayonet charge, the reliance on spiritual power over material factors, all of these had depended on a rough equality in rifle firepower that no longer existed. Japanese soldiers who survived Saipan and were evacuated to other islands carried this knowledge with them. Junior officers and enlisted men understood, even if high command did not fully acknowledge, that something fundamental had changed in infantry combat. The American semi-automatic rifle had transformed every enemy soldier into a base of fire unto himself. Yet the institutional machinery of the Imperial Japanese Army ground forward, sending replacements to island garrisons with the same training, the same doctrine, the same bolt-action rifles that had failed so catastrophically on Saipan. The war had nearly 14 months remaining, and thousands more Japanese soldiers would learn the lesson of American firepower the hard way. On Guam, liberated in August 1944, Japanese defenders faced the same overwhelming rifle fire. On Peleliu in September, Marines with Garands cleared cave complexes one position at a time, their semi-automatic fire suppressing Japanese defenders while assault teams maneuvered. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, the story repeated. Japanese soldiers trained for close combat died at medium range, killed by rifles that fired faster than their doctrine had anticipated. The final reckoning came on Okinawa, where over 100,000 Japanese defenders faced an American force equipped with every advantage industrial democracy could provide. By April 1945, the M1 Garand had been in mass production for nearly 4 years. American factories had delivered approximately 5 million rifles. Ammunition production exceeded 20 billion rounds of all types, with 30 caliber ammunition flowing to Pacific depots in quantities that Japanese planners would have considered impossible. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, had studied every previous Pacific battle. He knew that banzai charges failed against American firepower. He knew that night attacks met semi-automatic rifle fire that could decimate assault waves before they reached their objectives. He prepared the most sophisticated defensive system yet seen in the Pacific, with interconnected tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, and instructions to his troops to make the Americans pay for every meter of ground. But even defense in depth could not change the fundamental arithmetic of infantry combat. Japanese soldiers attempting to move between positions, to reinforce threatened points, to counterattack American penetrations, faced the same reality their predecessors had discovered on Guadalcanal, on Saipan, on every island where M1 Garands had come ashore. Movement in the presence of American infantry meant exposure to semi-automatic fire, and exposure meant death. The story of the M1 Garand in the Pacific War is ultimately a story about expectations and reality, about what happens when institutional beliefs collide with technological facts. Japanese soldiers went to war believing that their spirit could overcome material disadvantages. They died discovering that 8 rounds fired in 5 seconds could not be defeated by courage alone. The ping of an ejecting en-bloc clip became the sound of American dominance in the Pacific, a small metallic note that announced another 8 rounds had been sent toward enemy positions. Japanese soldiers learned to recognize that sound as the voice of firepower that could not be matched, of industrial capacity that could not be overcome, of a military system that had mechanized killing beyond anything their doctrine had prepared them to face. February 19th, 1945, 0900 hours, Red Beach, 1, Iwo Jima. Sergeant Darrell Cole of the 23rd Marines crawled across volcanic ash that seemed to swallow his every movement. His M1 Garand was clogged with the fine black sand that covered everything on this god-forsaken island, yet it continued to function. Around him, Marines struggled up terraces of loose cinder, while Japanese machine gun fire tore through their ranks from positions invisible against the dark terrain. Cole was a machine gun section leader, but he had discovered that the terrain on Iwo Jima often made machine guns impossible to position effectively. Instead, he fought with his Garand and grenades, personally assaulting Japanese pillboxes that threatened his company's advance. On this day, he would destroy 5 enemy positions before being killed by a grenade. His Medal of Honor citation would note that he personally accounted for at least half of the enemy troops destroyed in the initial breakthrough. The Battle of Iwo Jima epitomized what American semi-automatic firepower meant against defenders who had prepared the ultimate defensive position. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had studied every Pacific battle, had concluded that banzai charges were suicide against American rifles, and had built a fortress of 11 miles of tunnels connecting over 1,000 fortified positions. His orders to the garrison were explicit. No wasteful charges, no exposure to American firepower, fight from cover, and make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. Yet even Kuribayashi's defensive genius could not solve the fundamental problem. His soldiers still carried bolt-action Arisaka rifles. When Americans approached their positions, when suppressive fire forced Japanese defenders to keep their heads down, when the rhythm of combat required rapid response to changing threats, Japanese soldiers found themselves outmatched at the most basic level of infantry combat. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas of the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, was 17 years old when he landed on Iwo Jima, having lied about his age to enlist. On D-Day +1, he was in a trench when 2 Japanese grenades landed among his fire team. Lucas threw himself on one grenade and pulled another beneath his body, absorbing the explosions and saving 3 fellow Marines. He survived, barely, and would become the youngest Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. The incident that preceded Lucas's heroism illustrated the close-quarters nature of Iwo Jima combat. His patrol had been engaging a Japanese position at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. In such fighting, the M1 Garand's ability to deliver rapid aimed fire was the difference between overrunning a position and being destroyed by it. Corporal Tony Stein, also of the 28th Marines, demonstrated what aggressive use of automatic firepower could achieve. Armed with a modified aircraft machine gun he called a Stinger, Stein made 8 trips to the beach to resupply ammunition while attacking pillboxes along the base of Mount Suribachi. When his Stinger ran dry between resupply runs, he fought with his Garand, maintaining fire on enemy positions while covering the advance of his company. Stein was killed on March 1st, but his actions on D-Day helped establish the foothold that allowed Marines to fight their way to Suribachi's summit 4 days later. His Medal of Honor citation noted that he daringly attacked hostile cave positions and pillboxes and succeeded in neutralizing 20 of these positions. Many of them engaged with semi-automatic rifle fire when his heavier weapon was unavailable. The mathematics of Iwo Jima were staggering. 21,000 Japanese defenders faced 70,000 Marines over 36 days. Japanese casualties exceeded 20,000 killed, with only 1,083 prisoners taken. American losses were also severe, approximately 7,000 killed and 20,000 wounded, the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese. But within those numbers lay a story of firepower that kept American losses from being catastrophically worse. Captain Dave Severance commanded Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, the unit that raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. In post-war interviews, he emphasized the role of rifle fire in the fighting. The Japs couldn't move during daylight. Any movement brought Garand fire immediately. Our boys could put 8 rounds into a cave mouth or a firing slit in seconds. The Japs had to wait until we were very close to engage, and by then we'd already suppressed most of their positions with rifle fire. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima documented the effectiveness of American rifles in messages sent by radio to their command. One captured transmission, translated by American intelligence, stated, "Enemy rifle, fire density, unprecedented. Each position engaging our lines receives continuous aimed fire. Request guidance on counter-tactics." No effective guidance came, because none existed. The defense of Iwo Jima demonstrated that even the most sophisticated fortifications could not overcome the firepower disparity at individual weapon level. Japanese soldiers in caves and tunnels had to emerge periodically to engage attackers. When they did, they faced semi-automatic fire that could deliver multiple rounds before a bolt-action rifle could be worked once. First Lieutenant John Basilone, who had earned the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal for his actions with machine guns, returned to combat on Iwo Jima as a gunnery sergeant. He was killed on the first day while leading a machine gun platoon through minefields and heavy fire. His death symbolized the intensity of Iwo Jima combat, where even heroes of previous battles faced odds that courage alone could not overcome. But Basilone's machine guns and the Garands of the riflemen he led forward represented a combined firepower that Japanese defensive doctrine had no answer for. The Marines who survived Iwo Jima carried the experience forward to the final battle of the Pacific War. Okinawa would be the ultimate test of everything both sides had learned. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, L-Day for the invasion of Okinawa. 50,000 American soldiers and Marines waded ashore against virtually no resistance, a situation so unexpected that commanders suspected a trap. The trap existed, but it was not on the beaches. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had concentrated his 130,000 defenders in the rugged terrain of southern Okinawa in a system of fortifications centered on Shuri Castle that made Iwo Jima's defenses look improvised. The American advance south from the landing beaches brought infantry into contact with these positions in mid-April. What followed was 82 days of the most intense ground combat of the Pacific War. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Private First Class Desmond Doss of the 77th Infantry Division refused to carry a weapon due to his religious beliefs as a Seventh-day Adventist. As a medic, he accompanied rifle platoons into combat armed only with his faith. On the escarpment near Shuri, his unit was decimated by Japanese fire while attempting to scale a 400-foot cliff. Doss remained on the cliff edge, lowering wounded soldiers one by one with an improvised rope harness, eventually evacuating 75 casualties while under continuous fire. His Medal of Honor citation noted that he performed these rescues while enemy artillery, mortar and machine gun fire continued to rake the area. But it was the suppressive fire from American riflemen, their Garands keeping Japanese defenders' heads down, that created the windows in which Doss could work. Without the volume of fire that semi-automatic rifles provided, his heroism would have been suicide. The Battle of Sugarloaf Hill epitomized Okinawa's intensity. This small terrain feature, barely 50 feet high, changed hands 11 times over 9 days of fighting. American units attacking the hill faced interlocking fields of fire from Japanese positions on Sugarloaf and 2 adjacent hills, Horseshoe and Half Moon. The only way forward was through rifle fire, suppressing enemy positions one at a time while assault teams maneuvered. First Lieutenant Owen Stebbins of the 29th Marines led his platoon in one of the assaults on Sugarloaf. His after-action report described the methodology. We would identify a position, concentrate Garand fire on it until the enemy stopped shooting, then move riflemen forward while maintaining suppression. If the Japs in that position tried to engage, they'd take multiple hits before they could get a shot off. Their bolt actions just couldn't match our rate of fire. The mathematics of Sugarloaf were brutal. Over 2,700 Americans were killed or wounded taking this single position. Japanese casualties were also severe, though exact numbers remain disputed. The battle demonstrated that even determined defenders in fortified positions could be overcome through methodical application of superior firepower. Japanese defenders on Okinawa understood by now what they faced. Intercepted radio messages and captured diaries documented this awareness. Private Shigeru Nakamura of the 62nd Division wrote in his journal on May 3rd, "The American rifles fire without pause. We cannot move, cannot fight back effectively. Each time I raise my head to aim, bullets strike all around me before I can work my bolt. This is not warfare, as I was trained to understand it." Lieutenant Tadashi Kojo of the 32nd Infantry Regiment recorded similar observations before his death. Intelligence briefings told us American soldiers were poor marksmen who wasted ammunition. This is false. Each American soldier fires accurately and rapidly. Their rifles appear to be fully automatic, but must be semi-automatic based on the pattern of fire. We cannot match this rate of fire with our weapons. These Japanese testimonies, discovered after the war in diaries and documents captured or recovered from bodies, revealed that individual Japanese soldiers understood exactly what was happening to them. The institutional mythology of spiritual superiority had crumbled against the reality of semi-automatic firepower, but understanding did not equal the ability to respond. The Japanese military had attempted to address the firepower gap. The Type 100 submachine gun, introduced in 1942, provided automatic fire capability, but production totaled only approximately 27,000 units by war's end, insufficient to equip more than a fraction of infantry forces. The weapon also fired the 8mm Nambu pistol cartridge, lacking the range and stopping power of rifle ammunition. More revealing was the continued Japanese effort to copy the M1 Garand. At the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, engineers had been working on the Type 4 rifle since 1943. When American forces captured the facility in 1945, they found parts for approximately 250 rifles, but only 100 to 125 had been assembled into functional weapons. The Type 4 demonstrated that Japanese engineers fully understood the M1's advantages. They had even improved certain aspects, adding a last-round bolt hold-open feature and using a 10-round magazine loaded with 2 stripper clips. But Japanese industry, strained by shortages of materials and skilled labor, bombing raids on factories, and competing demands from naval and air programs, simply could not mass-produce the complex semi-automatic design. Meanwhile, American production had reached industrial absurdity by 1945 standards. Springfield Armory and Winchester had delivered approximately 5.4 million M1 Garands. Lake City Arsenal alone produced 200 million rounds of .30 caliber ammunition annually. The infrastructure of American industrial democracy, mobilized for total war, had created firepower advantages that no amount of Japanese courage or ingenuity could overcome. The final Japanese offensive on Okinawa came on May 4th, when Ushijima launched a coordinated counterattack designed to destroy American forces before they could consolidate their positions around Shuri. 25,000 Japanese soldiers attacked American lines in a conventional offensive, supported by what remained of Japanese artillery on the island. The assault made initial gains against the 77th and 96th Infantry Divisions, temporarily pushing back American lines along a multi-mile front. But as the attacking force moved beyond their prepared positions into open ground, they became vulnerable to the firepower they had previously avoided through defensive tactics. Captain Julian Dusenbury of the 77th Division commanded a rifle company in the path of the attack. His after-action report noted, "The Jap infantry came at us in organized formations, not the wild banzai charges we'd heard about, but disciplined tactical movements. It didn't matter. Our riflemen could put so many rounds downrange that their formations just disintegrated. They couldn't advance fast enough to reach us before our Garands cut them down." The May 4th offensive cost Japan approximately 5,000 killed for minimal territorial gains that were recaptured within days. Japanese commanders recognized that even conventional infantry tactics failed against American firepower advantages. The semi-automatic rifle had not merely changed the calculus of banzai charges, it had transformed all infantry combat. By June, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa was collapsing. American forces had breached the Shuri line, captured the ancient castle that had served as Ushijima's headquarters, and were systematically destroying remaining Japanese positions in the southern tip of the island. On June 22nd, Lieutenant General Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, committed ritual suicide in their final command post. Ushijima's last message to his troops acknowledged the futility of further resistance. "I depart with full faith in your continued courage. Fight to the last man. Even if this island falls, your spirits will inspire those who fight on." What Ushijima did not say, what institutional pride prevented him from acknowledging, was that his soldiers' spirits had been insufficient against American semi-automatic firepower. The courage of the Japanese garrison on Okinawa was beyond question. They had inflicted over 50,000 American casualties, the highest of any Pacific campaign, but they had lost over 100,000 killed, plus approximately 100,000 Okinawan civilians dead from the fighting. The firepower disparity had been one factor among many in this catastrophe. American artillery, naval gunfire, and air power had contributed enormously to Japanese casualties. But at the infantry level, where soldiers closed with each other in trenches and caves and ruined villages, the M1 Garand had provided an advantage that Japanese bolt-action rifles simply could not match. The planned invasion of Japan, Operations Olympic and Coronet, scheduled for November 1945 and March 1946, assumed that the M1 Garand would continue to provide this advantage. Military planners projected that American forces would face 2 million Japanese defenders armed, primarily with Arisaka rifles, plus millions of civilian militia equipped with everything from hunting rifles to bamboo spears. Production planning called for 500,000 replacement M1 Garands for the invasion, plus hundreds of millions of rounds of ammunition. The infrastructure existed to supply this demand. American industrial capacity, which had already delivered 5 million semi-automatic rifles, could produce more indefinitely. Japanese defenders would face attackers equipped with firepower advantages that had proven decisive on every Pacific island. The arithmetic that had destroyed Banzai charges on Guadalcanal, that had decimated counterattacks on Saipan, that had made movement lethal on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, would be applied to the Japanese homeland itself. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Olympic commenced. Historians continue to debate whether the bombs were necessary, whether Japan would have surrendered without them, whether the invasion would have produced the catastrophic casualties some planners predicted. What is beyond debate is that conventional American firepower, including the semi-automatic M1 Garand, had already demonstrated Japanese inability to match American infantry in direct combat. The atomic bombs accelerated surrender, but conventional weapons had already sealed Japan's fate. In the immediate post-war period, American occupation forces catalogued Japanese military equipment captured across the Pacific and in the home islands. The inventory revealed the scale of the firepower disparity. Japan had produced approximately 3 million Type 38 rifles and 3.5 million Type 99 rifles during the war, over 6.5 million bolt-action rifles in total. America had produced 5.4 million M1 Garands, plus millions of other automatic and semi-automatic weapons. But the raw numbers understated advantage. Each M1 Garand delivered 3 times the rate of fire of each Arisaka rifle. In practical terms, American infantry had possessed roughly 3 times the firepower of their Japanese opponents, rifle for rifle, soldier for soldier, throughout the Pacific War. Japanese military officers studied under American supervision after the war examined this disparity in detail. Colonel Takushiro Hattori, who served on the Imperial General Staff, wrote in a post-war analysis, "We understood theoretically that the American semi-automatic rifle provided advantages. We did not comprehend what this meant in practice until our soldiers faced it in combat. By then, it was too late to develop alternatives." The transformation of Japan from militaristic empire to pacifist democracy was driven by many factors: the atomic bombs, Soviet entry into the war, recognition of industrial inferiority, and a population exhausted by years of losing battles. But among the factors that convinced Japanese military leaders that resistance was futile was their soldiers' experience against American semi-automatic firepower. Japanese soldiers had been told they possessed spiritual superiority that could overcome material disadvantages. They discovered instead that pulling a trigger 8 times while their opponent worked a bolt twice created arithmetic that no amount of spirit could overcome. The M1 Garand did not merely kill Japanese soldiers, it killed the mythology of Japanese military invincibility. The lessons learned in the Pacific influenced military development worldwide. The Soviet Union, observing American success, accelerated assault rifle development. The AK-47, introduced in 1947, was designed to provide every Soviet soldier with fully automatic firepower. China restructured its military around automatic weapons after witnessing Japanese defeats. Even Japan's post-war self-defense forces, when established under American guidance in the 1950s, were built around semi-automatic and automatic rifles. The American military itself evolved. The M1 Garand served through the Korean War, where it once again demonstrated superiority against opponents armed with bolt-action weapons and, later, against Chinese forces, equipped with a mixture of captured Japanese rifles and early Soviet automatic weapons. The rifle remained in frontline service until the early 1960s, when it was replaced by the M14, itself essentially an improved Garand, with selective fire capability and 20-round detachable magazines. General George S. Patton's assessment of the M1 Garand as the greatest battle implement ever devised was not merely patriotic hyperbole. The rifle had transformed infantry combat, had given American forces decisive advantages in the Pacific theater, and had contributed to victory against an enemy whose courage was never questioned, but whose weapons technology belonged to an earlier era. The Japanese soldier of World War II was brave, disciplined, and willing to die for his country. These qualities had been sufficient against opponents with similar weapons technology. Against American infantry armed with M1 Garands, they were not enough. The final accounting revealed what semi-automatic firepower meant in practice. American forces in the Pacific suffered approximately 111,000 killed from all causes, while Japanese military deaths exceeded 2.3 million. Many factors contributed to this disparity: air power, naval superiority, logistics, strategy. But at the infantry level, where soldiers met in combat, the M1 Garand's rate of fire advantage was a constant factor that shaped every engagement. Today, both the M1 Garand and the Arisaka rifles rest in museums and private collections, artifacts of a war that ended nearly 80 years ago. The M1's distinctive ping, the sound of an ejecting en-bloc clip, has become iconic through decades of war films and video games. Collectors prize both weapons for their historical significance and mechanical qualities. The Arisaka, properly cared for, remains an accurate and reliable rifle. Post-war testing proved its action stronger than contemporary Mauser, Springfield, or Enfield designs. Japanese manufacturing quality, particularly in early war production, was excellent. The rifle failed not because it was poorly made, but because it was obsolete. The M1 Garand succeeded not because American soldiers were braver or more skilled than their Japanese opponents. It succeeded because American industrial democracy had invested decades in developing, testing, and mass-producing a revolutionary weapon system. John Garand's 17 years of development, Springfield Armory's perfection of manufacturing processes, Winchester's contribution of additional production capacity, these represented a national commitment to technological advantage that Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on spiritual factors, had not matched. The Pacific War proved that in modern industrial warfare, production capacity determines military capacity. Japan could train soldiers to accept death, could instill fighting spirit through years of indoctrination, could develop tactical doctrines based on aggression and close combat. It could not manufacture semi-automatic rifles in numbers sufficient to match American firepower. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, the young Marine from East Los Angeles who captured over 800 Japanese soldiers on Saipan through persuasion rather than firepower, understood this reality intuitively. He convinced Japanese soldiers to surrender by telling them what they already knew: that their rifles could not match American firepower, that their tactical doctrines were obsolete, that dying for the Emperor accomplished nothing when American semi-automatic fire made close combat impossible. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered to Gabaldon had experienced for themselves what intelligence briefings had dismissed. They had watched their comrades cut down by rifles that never stopped firing. They had tried to work their bolts while bullets struck all around them. They had learned that spiritual superiority was no match for industrial superiority, that warrior tradition could not overcome mechanical advantage. The story of the M1 Garand in the Pacific is ultimately a story about what happens when beliefs collide with facts, when doctrine meets technology, when institutional mythology faces industrial reality. Japanese soldiers went to war believing they could fire 5 rounds, advance while their opponents reloaded, and close for the bayonet fighting where their training gave them advantages. Instead, they discovered that American soldiers could fire 40 aimed rounds in the same time it took to reload 5 times with bolt-action rifles. They discovered that there were no pauses in American fire, no moments to advance safely, no opportunities to exploit. They discovered that the ping of an ejecting en-bloc clip meant 8 more rounds were already on the way. The mathematics were simple, the implications were devastating, and the lessons, written in the blood of tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers who died believing they could overcome material disadvantages through courage alone, shaped military thinking for generations to come. In the end, it was not a matter of spirit versus materiel. It was a matter of 8 rounds versus 5, of gas-operated semi-automatic action versus manual bolt manipulation, of American industrial capacity versus Japanese craft production. The M1 Garand did not win the Pacific War alone, but it provided an advantage at the infantry level that Japanese forces never overcame and never matched. The distinctive ping of that ejecting clip became the sound of a new era in warfare, an era where rate of fire mattered as much as accuracy, where industrial production determined combat capability, where the individual rifleman carried firepower, previously reserved for crew-served weapons. Japanese soldiers heard that sound and knew that everything they had been taught about warfare was wrong. They had expected pauses they could exploit. They found only continuous fire. They had expected material disadvantages they could overcome through determination. They found firepower advantages that determination could not address. They had expected war as their fathers had known it against the Russians. They found instead the industrial warfare of the 20th century, and they died by the thousands learning its terrible mathematics. The M1 Garand taught these lessons in the only language combat understands: overwhelming, sustained, lethal firepower, delivered faster than opponents could respond. 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger, reload in 3 seconds, 8 more rounds. Against bolt-action rifles designed for a previous era of warfare, this advantage proved decisive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.